Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Christian's Colloquy. As you can see, again, I am not alone. I'm joined by my friend, who I didn't ask beforehand, but going to call you Pastor Greg for now. But we go by Greg and Christian in the chats or by our usernames.
Yeah.
Anyway, but another
I was
friend
gonna say, I don't
from
think I've ever called you Christian in my
no,
life.
no, you haven't. I don't want to give away my Discord name, but as people can see, like Pastor David, who we had on recently, and then a long time ago at this point, Reese, we're all part of the same group of friends who are chatting about theology, church life, so much more. So, Greg, great guy. Happy to bring him on the channel. But before we dive into today's conversation, Greg, why don't you introduce yourself and let people know what you're up to?
Yeah, sure. My name's Greg Kite. I'm a pastor of a Trinity Baptist Church in Wamego, Kansas. Moved up here almost 2 years ago, actually. In about a month, that'll be 2 years since we've moved up here from Houston, Texas. And so while I was in Houston, I was a lay elder for a few years, right at the height of, well, not even the height, I mean, the beginning of COVID. And so was made an elder in I think it was February of 2019. And then
Hmm.
I mean, really, right then is kind of when a lot of those things began to happen, and with COVID and all the other stuff. And so we've got, and not just COVID, all of the other insanity that was happening with race relations in 2019, just
Yeah.
so many different things kind of thrown right into the fire of a lot of social issues and things like that in the church as a lay elder. And then over the course of time, working through seminary studies, I'm a student still, and I still will be probably for a few years at Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary, which is Sam Waldron Seminary up in Owensboro, Kentucky. Really wonderful program. If you're looking into seminaries, I highly recommend it. The rigor of the program is incredible for being what it is online, and the flexibility to actually continue in your ministry. I love CBTS, and I'd recommend it to anyone. But as I've been working through that, it just the opportunity came up where I could come up here to Kansas and help an aging congregation with an aging pastor, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. The guy up here who's been at Trinity Baptist Church for 42 years, 43
Wow.
years now, actually, is the Reverend Tony Mattia, and he's a well-known guy amongst Baptists in the area, and he seems to know everyone in the entire world. So it's actually been good for me to get a lot of connections as well. But Tony, recognized the need for his congregation to have some life in it, which is great because a lot of congregations don't really recognize the need for a revitalization, which is kind of some of our topic that we'll talk about today, and just to bring in fresh life and energy into the church. And so that's part of my job here is just to come up here and do that. And I'm generally the regular preaching pastor. I preach 90% of Sundays, I'd say, and been going through various sermon series, and it's just been a real joy to be up here. It's a very different world. I've lived in Houston, Texas for my entire life, really and truly, other than going to College Station for about 6 or 7 years total, living there for college and a few years after that with my wife. I should mention that I do have a lovely wife, Libby, and 5 children
Wow.
between the ages of about to be 11, or wow. Yeah, about to be 11, excuse me, and about to be 1 year old coming up here later this month. So,
Wow.
yeah, that's a little bit about me. Can't think of much else to say. So, yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you, Greg. And hearing all that, thank you so much for making time to be on the channel. Very busy guy, but I just want to encourage people. Greg has a channel and he collaborates with a couple of other guys. I know Lawson, I don't know Wes, maybe I do, but don't recognize the name immediately. But I encourage people to go check out the channel, link in the description down below, watch the videos, and leave comments encouraging Greg to post more. So find the time between 5 kids, studies, pastoring, preaching. So yeah, we want to see more content, but understand the realities of life.
Mhm.
Anyway, just want to acknowledge quickly, Greg and I, though we share a lot of theological similarities, of course, I think we share probably 99% of things, and we chat about it. Coming from Canada, I'm sure, and you from Americas, particularly Texas and Kansas, we probably have different cultural experiences in terms of church life, very similar in North America, but I think as you shared a bit like COVID, we shared a lot of the same questions, but Canada and America, very different approaches to
Yeah.
that stuff, the cultural stuff. Yeah, so definitely in the States, I know George Floyd was a big conversation. Here we had the residential schools. So a lot of similar stuff overlap, but I know for Canadians listening, this I want to acknowledge is a different perspective than you might hear in terms of just the realities of church life, given the challenges of the culture and, of course, the politics. I feel like in Canada, we are always watching the American stuff, but
Yeah.
living there, it's definitely different. And it's been such a joy on Discord to hear what it's like and how it relates to the same gospel, the same truth going out, but in different places, even when they look so similar on paper. But anyway, Greg, as you alluded to, we are talking about, I think the title we might go with is Reformation and Revitalization. So, a big topic. And some people, right off the top, they might be hearing that. And Reformation, they're thinking history and Martin Luther and revitalization. Unless you're in seminary or had taken seminary courses, you might not have heard the term unless you're active in church ministry or the work of revitalization. So why don't we just get started? Very important topic for a lot of different people, from pastors to I think people in the churches. So why don't we just define some terms and you can give us an idea of what we're getting at here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're right. I think Reformation for a lot of us, especially, I would imagine a lot of your viewership, a lot of my viewership of the people that
Yeah.
would listen to my podcast, are looking at Reformation and thinking straight back to Martin Luther and John Calvin and these guys, and that's kind of the ultimate telos of our theology, which is great.
Mhm.
But that's not really what we're referring to right now. One of the reasons that you and I were talking about me coming on here was just to discuss the idea of Reformation in a modern setting within a specific church. So when you talk about church reformation, generally what you're not speaking of is necessary. It is related a lot of times to reformational principles and things like that. But the idea is that we're trying to take a church that is maybe not as theologically grounded in those principles in various ways, and then reforming it to kind of function in a way that is more in line with those doctrines, with those practices. And so, for just a brief example, when I came up here, I actually kind of assumed that I was coming into more of a Reformed Baptist church. It is a church that has always, because Tony is a confessional Baptist, the church itself has as one of its doctrinal statements, as stated confession of faith, is the Second London Confession of Faith.
Mm.
And so, we look back at that as good Reformed Baptists, whether or not you like to use that term, good particular Baptists, maybe,
Right.
one way or another. We look back at that and think, okay, that's a really good document. And I kind of assume, well, a lot of our church then will probably understand some of the principles behind that, will be in line with that more or less. And that wasn't necessarily the case. And I think that's the case in a lot of places, where you just have a church that's not really as theologically or doctrinally grounded, or at least unified. I don't certainly, if anyone from my church ever came and listened to this podcast, I wouldn't want to give the idea that they're not, intelligent or anything like that.
Right.
There's a lot of incredibly smart people in my church, but the views are all a little bit different here and there. There's a good variety of differences, and while that's fine amongst the membership, it's one of those things where you want to kind of pull together and recognize that, well, the elders are going to be teaching from the framework that this church has adopted,
Right.
which is the Second London Confession. And so many people come into an entirely different situation, and they have to reform a church that doesn't even have that confession as its stated doctrine, right? And they have to come in and say, well, this is a church that has actually just a lot of doctrines that are really problematic in general, and they want to bring those things together and help point people to a maybe even a kind of a system of theology. We look at Gill's Doctrine of Divinity or Thomas Watson and these guys, and they write
Yeah.
these beautiful doctrines of divinity, and the reason is that they cohere together. And so we
Mm.
want to have that same sort of system, kind of that framework in our mind as a church going forward, and that's where it can be difficult. And when that does happen, you find that a church will interact within itself really well, and it will be able to do its outreach in a unified way. All of that's really important. And so reformation of a church really is involving that doctrinal aspect and just trying to make sure people are coming to the same page as much as possible and within the bounds of Christian conscience, which we would never want to overstep. But for
Right.
example, one of the things that I might do within that is I've been working on elder training manuals so that we can raise up a couple of men within the church. And I have within that elder training manual a whole section on confessionalism and learning
Mm.
what does it mean to be an elder in a confessional Baptist church? What is subscription to a confession? How do we organize our ministries and the things that we do within the church around our confessional dogma, and how do we come together as a unified board of elders, at least on that in that regard? And so those are things that you might work towards, among many other different practices in church reformation. But that's kind of a very brief description of that. Whereas revitalization is more about bringing new energy and new life into a church that maybe is losing it a little bit.
Mm,
I'm actually going through Revelation right now. I just started it on our Sunday evenings, and you think about the church in Ephesus and the idea that it's done all of these things, and it's held the faith, it's not lost its doctrine, but it's forgot its first love, and it doesn't seem to have the energy, the outpouring, the outreach of love that it once had, and that's what we want to avoid as churches, broadly speaking. And so what can happen, and especially I think it's you see it happening a lot more in rural settings these days, although it certainly can happen anywhere. But a lot of rural churches are dying because, quite frankly, there's just not a whole lot of young people out in rural settings, and so the energy that can be around those churches can just get kind of sucked out, and you're just left with a church that, while they are orthodox and sound in their teaching and things like that, there's just not a whole lot else going on. And
mm,
again, I don't think that I would want to put that necessarily on the church that I pastor now. But there is an element of that where ultimately they're just, I mean, when we came in, I think we're the youngest people in the church by about 20 to 30 years, and
right.
there was not a whole lot of younger folks in the church. That's not necessarily true, but as far as the average age of the church, it was much older. And
Mm,
so there was not a whole lot going on as far as outreach ministries. And those are things that I'm still slowly trying to incorporate and add back in. But there's a bit of a lack of energy, and you have churches that are not growing. And while, as a good reformed person, I'm never going to say that church growth is the marker of spiritual health of a church necessarily. There is an element where you want to say if a church isn't growing, if it's not doing outreach, if it's not soul winning, if it's not doing these things, then there's not a whole lot to be said for their vitality, right? Which
right.
that word revitalization is important. And so the idea of revitalization is injecting that energy back in, doing
Mm,
things with intentionality in order to bring that energy back to a church that they might regain that first love and go out and preach the gospel to the nations and seek to bring their community to Christ. Like those are things that have to be stoked up every once in a while. You might have sort of latent coals of gospel faith and a desire to reach out to your friends and family, but a revitalization effort's like taking the gallows to it and just stoking that flame once more to see a church that is on fire for the gospel and desires to go out into its community and really wants to bring the gospel out into its community, into its local setting. So that's the goal, and the tactics for that are things that we can discuss some of the
yeah.
things, but it's those are sort of the definitions I think that I would give,
Yeah.
broadly speaking, for those two terms.
No, Greg, thank you so much. That's very helpful. And just to say a few things in response to that, I think a lot of people, if they're watching this and they're in a very healthy, active church, they might be thinking, "Oh, wow, I'm sorry to hear that's going on there." And thinking of my own church in a great place right now, but people might not realize is that their healthy church right now, maybe a decade ago or 2 decades ago, there were some hardworking pastors and people who did that process of reformation and revitalization, which you're now inheriting. And I think that's the story for a lot of churches. And there are lots of reasons why a church could end up in a state where it needs reformation or revitalization. I think demographics is a big part of that. And there could be all sorts of different things. And maybe in my area, we're not rural here, but suburban. Sometimes churches, great churches, when a large, not making any shots here, but maybe a large mega church comes into town, scoops up all the young families, and leaves an otherwise healthy church needing reformation, needing revitalization to bring them
Yep.
back on track or to grow. So lots of reasons why they could bring there where it might look different whether you're in the heart of a downtown big city or in a rural place, but a lot of times there's work that needs to be here and maybe something we can get into later. Personally, I feel like this is where associational relationships with other churches are often super helpful in addition to having that historic tradition to pull on and bring to the forefront in terms of a confession. But Greg, I think you introduced the what's the issue here, and I think you got into the end goal quite well. But as you mentioned, we need to talk about that middle part. How do you get from point A, need reformation, need revitalization, both those big things? We can think of the doctrine and the unity of the church, but then also the outflow of that doctrine, hopefully in terms of outreach and discipleship and all those wonderful things. So I don't know how we're going to break this down because it is such a big topic and time is limited. But maybe pulling on your own experience or what you've seen other people do, or maybe how you taught, you arrive at a church, let's say. and you identify this is a church that needs reformation, needs revitalization. So maybe you could start with how do you identify those things, or what's that process? And then what are some initial steps? I assume there's some triage as speaking with other pastors. There's always the question of picking battles and timelines. So
Yeah.
maybe you could just start with early stages of how do you recognize that, and what do you do as a first step or two?
Yeah. Yeah. So for Reformation in particular, we'll start with that and maybe move to some of the
Yeah.
revitalization things, but they really do kind of need to be treated separately.
Mm,
But for Reformation, one of the things that you might notice when you come into a church is, and actually I think it takes some time. It was probably 6 months before I really recognized that, oh, wow, there's a lot of folks in our church, and this is just a product of being a pastor and
yeah.
getting to know your sheep, getting to know your congregation. Who are the people they listen to? What are the kind of, I mean, really, what are the Bibles they carry? What are the study Bibles they're using?
Yeah.
What are the resources that they're ingesting outside of the church itself? And then once you start to learn that and hear that, and as you start getting into certain topics, you may get pushback on things here and there that
Mm,
you weren't expecting. Say, oh, okay, well, this group of people, or maybe this many folks in the church believe in this way regarding this thing, and that's actually opposed to our doctrine, or our stated doctrine of the church, or maybe it's not, and maybe you're coming into a church and you just want to bring people along to a more reformed doctrine, which I think is an admirable thing to do. Although I also believe that that's something that needs to be very clear up front. As an aside, I think a lot of times I've seen people try to go into a church situation where they know it's not a church that is aligned with their own personally held belief. Like a new pastor will go into this situation, and they're going to say, well, we're just going to kind of mold the church around my will, right? Well,
mm,
first of all, we're Baptists. That's not really an acceptable practice, right?
yeah.
And the congregation must decide its own confession of faith.
Yeah.
In my case, I came into a church where a congregation had decided at some point, I mean, granted, it was 40 years ago,
Yeah.
that the confession of faith that they're going to mold around is the 1689 or the Second London. And so it's a little easier for me. So it's a lot harder, I think, for somebody who's coming into a position where they want to make those changes, and the congregation's like, well, no, we want to push back against that. And that's where you get these stories about pastors who are, Calvinists going into a very mainline sort of SBC church and saying, or something like that, an
Yeah.
equivalent maybe that you have up there,
Yeah.
going into those kinds of churches and trying to do this work of reformation and getting really into it, and they start getting pushback, and they continue to push against that pushback, and it becomes conflict, and eventually they get let go. And the reason that they quote is, well, yeah, I got fired because I was a Calvinist. I'm like, well, maybe that's true,
Right.
but there's also an element of, did you actually, were you upfront with that? Was that something that you've let people know in advance? Like, hey, I want to come in. You've asked me to come and be the pastor of this church. I want you to know this is what I believe. This is what I will teach. Are you okay with that? And sometimes people try to sneak in the back door with Cal. I don't think that's the best solution for
Yeah.
some of these things. But a lot of churches are recognizing the fact that, well, we need to actually get back to some of these core principles and these truths, and we need someone to guide us along with that.
Mm,
That's a really good place to start with Reformation if you can. And so that's just the beforehand. But once you start getting into it, you recognize, as I was hinting at before, that people maybe held different beliefs, and then you find ways to address those things. Really and truly, I believe in the ordinary means of grace. I believe
mm,
in the fact that the preaching of the word from the pulpit is absolutely going to be the primary thing that brings this whole movement of Reformation along. And so, for example, when I first got here, the very first book that I chose to preach was Ephesians, because I'm going to
mm,
jump into Ephesians chapter 1 and immediately start getting into some of these doctrines. Now, again, it helps for me that on our sign in front of Trinity Baptist Church, it says preaching the doctrines of grace. So I
right.
don't have to worry too much.
Yeah.
Some people may have to worry a little bit more and take a little bit more slowly, but I was able to jump in and say, okay, well, I'm going to talk about Ephesians chapter 1. And within the first 3 or 4 sermons, I'm talking about predestination and election and some of these doctrines that I think are really important. Um, and again, I don't think that Reformation is necessarily even limited to Reformed theology.
Right.
But for all intents and purposes, I think it's probably a helpful standard to use.
Y-
Um, so I think that's the best place to
Yeah.
begin, as
No, that's perfect. Yeah. So let's dive in. I think you're right. Let's talk about Reformation first, because these are two massive topics, and what it sounds like is one church could need one and not the other, or vice versa, depending
yeah,
where they're at. So just thinking about Reformation, something around the same time as you, I was finishing my seminary pastoral internship and getting into church leadership that 2019, 2020. And something I realized beginning to take on that role, meeting with my pastor, who was super wonderful at discipling me and walking me through what's it like being a pastor and doing some home visits and just praying for the congregation. And one of the things I realized is, and something I think one, people might realize about people at their own church, or I think reflect on themselves is what are you consuming? And something I
Mhm.
didn't realize is you have so many wonderful, godly Christians sitting in pews or chairs on a Sunday morning, active and great believers, but then you would be shocked to know that they're listening to prosperity preachers during the week. And
Right.
that's
Mhm.
where they're getting a lot of their theology. And when you realize that, you start thinking, hey, these are people I look up to. They're amazing, which I think is still probably true in most cases. But then you might listen to the prayer and realize, oh, that's they're believing that they're really manifesting something here, or something along those lines. So that might be a place where if you're listening to this and maybe you're a young person, but still be thinking about what you're consuming outside of your local church and how you're bringing that into that. But Greg, I think you brought up a great point that I think we need to start with. When people might think of Reformation, and I think Reformed theology is a place often people go, or the doctrine of God, trying to get solid on that, and or some places it's a robust understanding of what the church is, whatever it might be. You brought up the ordinary means of grace and the ordinary work, like truly ordinary work of a pastor. You think of preaching, you think of praying, you think of what a pastor does. And that seems to be a starting ground for the work of Reformation. And you chose that sermon series from Ephesians to really dive into it as a place to start. Do you think that that was a theological choice you made to say, hey, I need to be preaching this stuff rather than doing it on the side? Or was that a practical, hey, when I'm preaching in a pulpit, I have undivided attention, or maybe a bit of both? If you could just bring us into the back room and let's say what's the thought process there?
Yeah, well, so interestingly for Ephesians, I mean, I had
Yeah.
just gotten there and I just
Hmm.
needed to decide what's a book that I can preach from that I think will be beneficial in general. I hadn't actually worked through, I mean, really at the time, I hadn't even really thought of it as, oh, there's some reformation that needs to happen. I just thought,
Right.
well, this would be a good book to preach through because it's something that, I'm interested in. I think it's something that is beneficial as you I had in my mind at the time, I was thinking about the wonderful flow of that book from 1 through 3, this wonderful doctrine of God. I'd been really studying doctrine of God a lot in that time.
Mm.
And then moving into the second half and like, okay, well, here's the practical application. I think that'll be really beneficial for a church. Like no matter what church you go into, Ephesians is
Yeah.
great. Over time, I started to see, oh, hopefully some of these things that I'm saying from Ephesians are making sense. I think a better example actually is currently some of the things that I've noticed regarding our church governing documents and some of
Mm.
those kinds of other things, and even just the way that the life is run in our church. I would say that are not is not quite in line, and it's pretty good, but it's not quite in line in certain aspects with a good ecclesiology as laid out in our confession of faith. And so part of the reformation of that aspect of our church was me choosing I'm gonna preach through First Timothy now. And
Mm.
so I think it's maybe a better example for what you're talking about. I had initially seen some little things here and there, and over the course of the last 2 years, I've just really seen, well, here are places where there's not necessarily a great understanding of what an elder is and what an elder does. So maybe that would
Right.
be a good thing for me to preach on, so that people will know that. And like you said, I know I have undivided attention during that time, and I can explain here's the task of an elder, here's where you see elders identified in the scriptures, here's how Jesus Christ is the chief shepherd and the head of the
Mm.
church, and those are things that I mean, really, even this last week, that was my entire sermon was discussing that because I was going through qualifications.
Right.
And so as I was thinking through those things, I thought this would be a very helpful sermon series to discuss. And I also did a whole Wednesday night set of sermons on, I mean, I would call them Bible studies, I guess, on Wednesday nights on church polity and
Mm.
going more into the details and the history of how these things came up and why we think from Scripture that congregationalism, at least for our church, congregationalism is what we think to be the biblical form of church polity. And so going through those things and just preaching it has been very helpful. Of course, yeah, I think that you can say that that's not always going to take root in people, and then I think that there are some people who are always going to sit out there with sort of a combative attitude and want
Yeah.
to want to push against those things. But that's I
Yeah.
think that as far as the background process of how I choose the sermon series
Yeah.
in this work of Reformation, I think it's probably the best way of putting it.
No, and that's great to hear. And that's one thing, again, I'm not trying to put anyone on blast here, but there's often discussions about using a common lectionary across a denomination. We're all preaching the same thing versus pastors choosing what they preach. One advantage, I think, of pastors not following a denominationally set outline is that pastors, you know what your congregation needs, and you can, hey, question of elders, let's go to First Timothy, let's talk about it. And I think that's wonderful. And I think that's something whether people right here, whether you're a pastor, a seminarian, or a youth leader, I know I have a lot of youth leaders, pay attention to the questions that people are asking and think about what passages might be brought to bear. And sometimes it might be not something you're super passionate about, but it's what your people need to hear. And I think that's a wonderful example. So, Greg, thinking about your answers on Reformation and this stage, I think there's probably three questions that I came to my mind, and I'll give you a broad outline. I want to talk about leveraging or making use of those confessional documents because most churches, I think, the often an issue is they're not aware of their confessional documents, whether it's a big thing like the Second London Baptist or I know in the States the Baptist Faith and Message, one of
Yeah.
those, they have a few different years, are pretty solid that people can work with. In our fellowship, we have our own statement of faith that oftentimes an issue is you have, as you mentioned, you have the document right there and it's just a question of bringing it to the fore. So we'll come to that. I want to talk about how you said raising up elders around you. I think that's probably a key thing, those allies and also those people to do the work of ministry. Then finally, I want to get to pushback and graciously but firmly, I think, responding to that. So going back to the beginning, those confessional documents. So um, your church, when you arrived, had the Second London, and and they had a little slogan on the church sign, which makes things easier. But maybe you could just talk about how do you, for a church that officially has what might be an excellent statement, an excellent confession, what kind of work do you do to let people know about that and to really instill the understanding that this is something we've come around and that maybe it's a sense of, hey, you agreed to believe this, or here's why you should want to. What's the approach to bringing that to the people?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it helps certainly to be direct about it whenever you are if you're planning a time where you know you're going to have a group from the church or at least a core group of the church
Mm,
that you're able to specifically address confessionalism. That's helpful in some ways. I think broadly speaking, though, that's not always going to be the best approach to things. More often than not, the better way of trying to get people aware first, and you may jump into that series like I'm almost 2 years in, and I'm sitting here trying to plan out when I want to begin a series going through the Confession of Faith,
right,
the Second
right.
London, and I'm excited to do it. Don't get me wrong; I would love to have started it as soon as I got here, but I just don't think that it was necessarily the right time. And over
Mm,
the course of time, what I've started doing is I just inject the Second London into my sermons. I inject it wherever I can, and not as a like a some kind of extraneous like this is aligned with Scripture or something. I believe no, not aligned, it is aligned with scripture. But what I mean is not holding it in the same sense. And I make that clear. But oftentimes I'll say, here's a bunch of scriptures and we're talking through a concept within the passage that we're studying. Well, here's what the Second London Confession, our stated confession of faith, says about that. And I use that phrase, by the way, and
yeah,
it's kind of subversive, but
yeah,
I use it over and over again, right? I've said probably hundreds of times since I've been here, our stated confession of faith says this. And what that
subliminal.
does is it
Yeah.
gets into people's minds that, oh, we've stated something. We actually have the document that we have come around in some way, even if I've never really thought about it. And what I've come to find out is that, quite frankly, most people in my church have never actually read through the Second London Confession of
Mm,
Faith. And
right.
it was stated 40 years ago when the church was constituted. And so now a lot of people just haven't actually read it. And so I'm consistently trying to get people to read it. Another thing that I think is really helpful when we have new members classes, which we've had a
Mm,
couple of times now, I've been very clear. I give every single person who's a prospective new member a copy of the Second London Confession of Faith, and I say to them, like, I want you to read this, and we won't move forward necessarily in this process until you have. It's not that long. It's like 30 some odd pages, and if you can't read through that, then I'm not really sure that you're committed enough to be a member of a church
right.
anyway, to be quite honest. Which sounds harsh to some people who I think are so used to this very open, coming and going
Yeah.
within the church. and that there's not really a true sense of membership and held accountability. But it's not that much to ask, quite honestly, for you to read 30 pages of something. There's still about th if you read through one of those EULA things that you have to click on to say I agree whenever you use a new software, those are probably about 30 pages to be perfectly honest with you.
Right.
And everyone just skips to the bottom of them and hits agree. So I'm just asking you to read what we believe as a church before you get there. So that way you know. And I think it's really
Yeah.
important that you know what's going to be taught. And so that's a really important part of it, is getting to that. But also just teaching in accordance with it as much as you possibly can. Bringing it up in sermons is very helpful. And you don't have to be a second London guy or a Westminster person. You don't have to hold to the historic Reformed confessions of faith to do this. I had a question posed to me whenever I first got here about whether or not the Trinity began in the New Testament.
Oh,
And
okay.
and that was an interesting question to me, because it took me out of left field, because I'm sitting here in a church that I was like, oh, this is the second London church. These people will know. And you can't assume that your people are going to know anything, by the way. That's just something you have to kind of come to grips with as a
Yep.
pastor. But like, even in a Southern Baptist church, you should be able to say, well, the Baptist faith and message says that there is only one living and true God. It says that that the eternal triune God reveals himself to us as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, with distinct personal attributes, but without division of nature, essence, or being. That's great language from the Baptist Faith and Message 2000.
Hmm.
And as a generally an SBC church, and again, I know this doesn't apply to maybe some of your listeners, but a lot of you will have very similar
Yeah,
statements. I mean, the Baptist
definitely.
Faith and Message is a derivative of the Second London Confession.
Yeah.
And so as you pull through these confessional documents, not just about the doctrine of God, but about the doctrine of salvation, an understanding of the Lord's Day. I mean, there's many different things that you can go through, even in more modern confessional documents. And even, we had a statement of faith at my church in Houston that was not, it was kind of an abstract of the abstract of principles.
Yeah.
And so it was something that was created more or less by the pastor of the church that I was there. And it was a good, solid confession in that way. But you could go back and point to that and say, this is what we teach here, and this is what we think you ought to believe, and here's the scriptures that are behind that.
Mm.
So it's helpful to be able to do that and to pull those documents back in that way. So wherever you can interject it, but I think a big part of it is just getting in people's minds that, yeah, like, this is a stated confession of faith, and it's
Yeah.
something that we as a church hold to. And then you have to parse out what that means, but that's another
Right.
conversation.
No, Greg, that's great to hear. And I just want to encourage people. This is unconfirmed what I'm about to say, but I think I recall from my Baptist history class in seminary that my church's fellowship statement of faith was adapted from a similar stream of going back to the abstract of principles. So a lot of overlap there. And as we revise our statement of faith now, some of the changes we're making are meant to bring our statement of faith in line with wording from that same tradition of Baptist thought. So something that we share, I think, and maybe people would be interested to know, because if you like your statement of faith now, good chance if you're theologically inclined, you'll like some of those older ones. So a quick little plug, check those out. Another thing I want to emphasize, Greg mentioned, is that I think that was great to hear in terms of membership and being upfront with people. What are you agreeing with? One thing I appreciate about my new 6 or 7 years at this point, our new pastor at my church, was he brought the membership standards where, hey, you're actually agreeing to something. This isn't just you're signing a paper, you're joining a group of people who confess certain things. And for my years on the board, coming out of seminary, I was one of the elders who did the membership interviews. And I just want to say, if you're someone who's joining a church in the near future, surprise the elder doing the interview with you and actually read the statement of faith. It will bring
Yeah.
joy to their hearts. I had a friend coming out of Pentecostalism into the Baptist world, actually read the statement of faith and noticed that we believe that there's perseverance of the saints, which he didn't believe. And he said, I caught that in your statement of faith. And I was like, of course, we had to talk through that, but I was elated that someone actually read it
Oh,
and
yeah.
took it seriously, because they want to confess with the church what they believe and what we believe. So I think that's something to take seriously on the congregation end. Uh, Not only is your pastor, in this case, Greg, trying to inform you what you believe, but also recognize that you agreed to this at some point, and maybe you treated it like I think that's great, the terms of service on a product, but this is a church, the Church of Jesus Christ. Maybe you actually want to read that thing before you click
Yeah.
I accept. I think that there's a sermon illustration in there somewhere
Yep.
to bring that up. But Greg, I think that that's great to hear, and maybe a good transition point, making sure your members, being upfront with them, knowing what we believe. But in addition to the members, I now think the elders, where oftentimes, at least from what I've heard, and maybe you could share more about your experience, and I'm sure lots of pastors talk about this, the first group of people they need to get on board. Sometimes they need to get some elders, but sometimes the first people they need to get on board are those elders, and those elders who are regular people with a high calling and have taken on a great task. Sometimes there's some work that needs to be done there, and I think you mentioned doing studies. I know that my pastor was intentional meeting with the elders, which I think is fantastic. But maybe we could talk that about that a bit more. I know a lot of people watching, a lot. Some of the people watching are young men aspiring to eldership, which is great. But maybe tell them about the other side. How do you approach training elders or working with elders and raising up these people in the context of Reformation?
Yeah. I think I can't speak too authoritatively to it. I mean, I
Yep.
can't speak authoritatively to anything, let's be honest. But but I can't in this particular um kind of line of reasoning
Yeah.
because Tony is the only elder whenever I came here, right? And Tony
Mm-hmm.
is he's a subscriptionist to the 1689, and so I don't have to worry about that in that regard.
Yeah.
We have some differences of opinions on how to apply things, but I will say though, as I've been working through trying to figure out the best way to raise up elders within the church,
Yeah.
and to train them and really get them ready for ministry within our particular church as a church that does want to hold fast to the confession of faith that's been given to us, and that in this case, of course, is the scriptures and it is the gospel of the Apostle Paul. But we believe it's best represented as our stated confession of faith in the Second London. And so, with all that said, like whenever I'm thinking through how we want to approach elder training, whenever I was even typing up this document yesterday, I've been working on this for a while because
Yeah.
I want to raise up a couple of guys, and it's been difficult to identify and work through who's going to do that. But that's an aside. As I've been thinking about that, though, I figured out the different kinds of books and resources that I want them to read and understand and work through with them. And for example, one of them that we're going to do is just work through over the course of the entire sessions of going through that elder training is going through the 1689 confession very, very intentionally, point by point, and using
Mhm.
resources alongside of it. And so I have in my sort of syllabus for the elder training is that I want them to utilize Sam Waldron's commentary or
Yeah.
exposition of the Second London Confession.
Yeah.
It's a
Great
really
book.
incredible resource. It goes into the scriptures behind it. It goes into some of the biblical reasoning behind it. I also have as an additional resource if you choose to read it. Frankly, I think that very few people have the time to sit down and work through all of Dr. Renahan's exposition
Yeah.
of the 1689. What is it called? For the Not for the vindication of the truth. I always call it that one. To the judicious
Yeah.
and partial reader,
Yeah.
which is an incredible, 1,500 page
It's a
tome.
tome. It's a tome. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love it, but it's a little bit more historical, and it pulls in some other things that I frankly I think are less important for the average elder to come into,
Yeah.
whereas Dr. Waldron's is a little bit more streamlined. And guys, that's important. If you're a pastor coming to a church, please recognize that not everyone who is going to be an elder is going to be like you and I who are coming out of seminary and are like bookworms, bibliophiles, people who want to soak up all this knowledge, but they need to be able to answer the claims of truth. They
Yeah.
need to be able to answer when somebody has an objection to something within the confession. They need to be able to answer those things.
Mm.
And if they're not able to do that in a coherent way, because they haven't studied it, then that's problematic for an elder.
Yeah.
And so for me, my goal is less to get them to use the joke phrase amongst our server, hyper confessionalists. Like
Yeah.
I don't want them to be hyper confessionalists, but I do want them to know and understand why is what we are talking about in that document. I feel like this whole podcast has turned to confessionalism. That's fine.
That's
Believe me,
allowed.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Why does it say what it says, and
Mm.
why should we believe that? And so an elder needs to be able to do that, and that it really is a big part of church reformation. If you're bringing along new elders, which for me, a big part of the reformation of my church is ecclesiological. I'm trying to get them to understand the plurality of elders and have them have a desire to have that plurality of elders, and but that plurality needs to be unified, and we're unified by our confession.
Yeah. No, that is great to hear, and I think that's something that a lot of people need to hear. So I'm not going to pretend I'm nine marks and I'm reaching a bunch of pastors who need to hear this, but I do have a good number of people who are aspiring to that, as I mentioned. But then also, I think this is great to hear from the other side of people hearing, where one thing that my pastor encouraged us recently preaching through First Timothy qualifications of elders, where yes, elders are called to hold certain attributes and to do certain things. But that passage is for everyone to hear because many of those things you should still aspire to knowing your stuff, having those characteristics, being well read and aware as long as you're able to. I think that that's something where why not? And being able to answer questions about your faith, that's something you want to take seriously. And I think it's also great to hear, yes, not everyone has time to read the tomes, or sometimes small books I know for people are a challenge. And that's where practical encouragement, lots of great podcasts out there from great people. Like so often, I think Sam Waldron and Renahan, you can find lectures from them, listen to it on your commute or while you're on the exercise bike, whatever it might be. Audiobooks are fantastic. I know some people get on me saying I'm not actually reading. Quick aside, Greg got one of those earlier. I will say audiobooks, it's like ancient history. You never had books for a long time. Someone had to read them to you or proclaim them. It's tapping into that. So audiobooks,
I agree.
that's not cheating. But and if you disagree, Greg, we could talk
No,
later
I
about
agree.
some. Oh, you agree. Excellent.
Yeah.
We're on the same page, so you could take that as truth. Anyway, so that's where I'll say that's a great word to hear, especially if you're a person aspiring to eldership. That's what your pastor might be thinking and the line they might be going down. And if you are a pastor, I think Greg offers some great insight there. But the reality, Greg, before we get to revitalization next, we have one more thing. You mentioned pushback. I'm sure for a lot of churches, maybe not as much your own, but I can think of my own church. We went from dispensational in some interesting ways to now I think we would consider ourselves small R, Reformed, Baptist, that kind of world, not dispensational and now Calvinistic and those kind of things. And along the way, I was a kid through most of this journey. I've been at the same church since 18 months and now I'm 28, but I saw some of that. And it's interesting to see people work through those challenges. But I think a big part of how you reform a church and how you go on this process of reformation is how you present the information. And probably a big step is how you respond to that pushback. So maybe you could just give us some details or some ideas. What kind of pushback can you expect? And what are some avenues you could take to respond well in a way that's loving, firm, or any other characteristic you need to have?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and the primary things, kind of similarly, I think, to your situation, but maybe less institutionalized. Like we have a lot of folks who, uh, actually, you know what? Really, all this goes back to some of the resources that people are getting outside of the church.
Yeah.
And sometimes, if you're coming into a situation where you are entering into a maybe a dispensational church with a mind to reform it, and I don't want to limit it to that. Maybe you're a dispensationalist coming out of the masters and you're trying to help people come along to what you believe.
Right.
I don't condone that, but it is what it is. I'm trying to speak more broad principles here.
Yeah.
Whenever you're making those discussions happen and people start to push back against you, well, the first thing you have to do is be gracious with them. I've had people push back on me on Calvinism, broadly speaking, limited
Yeah.
atonement. And again, I think a helpful thing to do is to utilize your position as a pastor, as somebody who's able to teach, to present all of those things. And it's good to be able to do those things in a one-on-one session if you can. But what you have to realize is a lot of the times what you're actually competing against is not just somebody's mind, it's the resources they're getting outside. A lot of folks in our church listen to American Family Radio, which, if you have listeners who are familiar with that, then basically it's just a kind of a conservative leaning. I think it broadly speaking is a net positive, a conservative leaning outlet for publishing sermons and other Christian doctrinally related ideas. I don't know if that's really the best way of putting it,
Right.
but I would just say that AFR, personally, I don't really. I wouldn't listen to it on my own. I might listen to it if I'm trying to figure out what my people are listening to, but I just think that a lot of what's put out on there is from a very different hermeneutic. It's from a very different understanding of scripture and church history and all sorts of things like that than I would come to acknowledge myself. And so recognizing that a lot of people, my people, are listening to that, I may need to specifically counter specific things on there in
Mm.
my teaching. And I want to do all these things graciously. If you need to set up, if there are people that you have the kind of relationship where you can get together over coffee and have those conversations, that's great. But other people may respond better as you just kind of continue to preach the word. And so,
Yeah.
when I started getting a little bit of pushback on Calvinism, which kind of shocked me, honestly, considering, like I said, preaching the doctrines of grace is on our sign.
Yeah,
But whenever I started getting that pushback, I thought, well, okay, let me go through a series on the doctrines of grace. And so we took that time, and people came and were able to ask questions. And you can graciously answer those questions and be humble about it. That's the really important part. A lot of people just don't respond well to you if you are prideful in your theology and you think, well, this is certainly it. I
yeah,
have the right answers. I have everything for you, rather than saying, look, from my understanding of the scriptures and from what I believe that church history most like best teaches and our tradition as Baptists, like this is what seems to the scriptures are teaching. And what it seems to be that is the best way of explaining it and applying it in our own lives. And so, if you can be humble about it, I think a lot of people just respond to you a lot better. And I've been able to preserve a lot of relationships with folks, with several folks. There's not too many, but several folks who push back against Calvinism in our church. And the same thing with dispensationalism, for example. And right now, for me, that looks like teaching through Revelation.
right.
It's been a couple of years where I've had time where I stopped and had a very short 2 week thing on Israel and the church and trying to bring people's minds along in that to a biblical understanding of the continuity there. But there are people who hold to a very firm discontinuity within my congregation, and I love them, and I want them to come along to my point of view. But I'm trying to be humble about it, and what I'm going to do is just continue to preach the word and show them how I believe that it's structured, how I believe we should interpret the book of Revelation, which is my Sunday night series now.
Nice.
And hopefully, over the course of time, people will say, that makes more sense than what I thought. And
Hmm.
if they don't come to that conclusion, I'm still going to love them. They may not be able to be elders in our church. That's okay.
Right.
But yeah, that's what I would say.
No, no, that's good. And Greg, I want to just extend that out a bit more. So, people, if you're listening, you're hearing a pastor say being humble and sharing these truths is essential. We talk about it online a lot since 2010s, the cage stage Calvinist to the cage stage confessionalist to the cage stage classical theist to the patriarch, whatever it might be, blah, 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 blah. Even though people talk about cage stage stuff all the time, there's a reason why people have to keep talking about it because I know from my own experience and people around me, it is so easy to get excited about these truths and sharing these truths, whether from a pulpit or from being just a active member of a church. But not being humble with it or not being understanding, you are just creating more obstacles, and that's something you want to take seriously. And I really appreciate what you're saying. Hey, sometimes just stick with it, just keep preaching it, answering the questions. You don't need to win someone over in an argument face to face in one day. It might be a process. Of course, if you grew up believing something, it might be shocking, but I like that as an end goal. Hopefully, over time and getting to know your character and seeing the way you share it, that encourages people to take it seriously. And one day they might just say, that makes more sense than what I used to believe. And that
Yeah.
applies to many, many, many things because we have a lot of doctrines. But
That's how I became a Baptist. I
up,
mean, just to be very honest, I won't go into all the details of that, but moving
yeah,
from Presbyterian to Baptist was just a function of listening to the elder that God had put over me at that
yeah.
time, and coming to the conclusion that, I think he's right on this, and
Mhm.
then digging in further.
No, that's a great word. And I think it applies going the other way as well. So often I hear people saying what stopped me from becoming a Calvinist or a Baptist or whatever it might be was just I knew some nasty people online. I knew some nasty people in real life. So loving people and encouraging people that works positively. And I think quite reasonably, doing the opposite has the opposite effect. And
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
think scripture speaks to that just in terms of your character matching the truth. So Greg, that's great. I want to respect your time, so maybe we can jump over to revitalization.
Yeah.
This one, not getting as much into the confession, I would imagine, so we might be a bit quicker with us bookworms here. But revitalization, another big topic. I think people might be eager to hear about that because it might be something that they're going through or I've seen people
Mhm.
go through. So maybe you could just refresh us. What are we talking about again? And then what are those early steps and we could walk through it from there.
Yeah. And first, I think I would say too that I mentioned earlier that these are kind of separate disciplines, Reformation and Revitalization, but they're absolutely inherently linked.
Yeah.
We all believe. I think literally anyone in any tradition will tell you that your theology leads to your practice, your piety leads to your practice. And so the
Yeah.
more that you understand, you come along in your doctrine, the more that you're going to kind of flourish in the way that you actually live out that faith. And that's true of anyone and any tradition. But I will say it does drive me crazy now whenever I see pastors or preachers who get up there and they will give a very intellectual sort of lecture kind of sermon and then sit back down. And there's just not really any exhortation. And I think I've experienced that in many churches across my life, and where it's just it's an intellectual exercise, and I've gotten a lot of this, but there's not the unction there to say, this is how it applies. This is how you then go forward and you live that out, and then you actually bring this message of this doctrine, this gospel that we're trying to preach to you out into the nations. And so that's what revitalization is about. And whenever I got here, I probably leaned more toward into the intellectual side of
Right.
sermons, and I still, I try to bring forward the meaning of the text. I do exegesis. I spend a lot of time in the study, trying to figure out how do I best parse out these texts. But then that application part is so inherently important. That I think a lot of people just miss, and the recognition of who Christ is, what He's revealing about Himself in this word and this sermon. How do we then go forward and make that into a reality in the way that we live out our faith in the community as a church, right? And when we're talking about revitalization, now we're kind of taking it from that individual aspect to a more corporate aspect. How do we as a church act in such a way that we actually, believe what we say we believe?
Right.
And so that's the personal exhortation. Just make sure that your piety is actually leading to your praxis. And if it doesn't, then there's some disconnect there that shouldn't be there. But once you get those things right and you get them in line, then really we're just trying to figure out the best way of injecting that life back into a church. And unfortunately, there's just no formula for
Right.
revitalization. I wish there was, because I'd be following it right now and
Yeah.
not struggling through the whole process myself. As much as I've seen so much growth in so many ways in our church, there's still a lot of things to do. There's still a lot of moving forward, and that idea of injection of energy again. We've not done nearly the amount of outreach that I would like to do. We've not done nearly the amount of street preaching and evangelism and door to door soul winning, not trying to
Yeah.
invite people to church and those kinds of things. We just haven't done as much of that yet, because I'm trying to pull us along in that regard. But there is a lot that we have done. And
Mm.
sometimes I have to remind myself of how much actually has occurred so that I don't get disappointed or
Yeah.
discouraged. But the key, I think, as a pastor, well, that's just revitalization. Just to get back to your question,
Yeah.
revitalization is just that idea of revitalizing,
Y-
giving life again to a church that maybe has somewhat lost its desire and flame, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's great, Greg. But I want you to continue that thought where you were going. So
Yeah.
just keep riffing there.
Okay.
That's good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was just trying to move forward, I guess, from that into like, well, what do you do then?
Yeah. No,
Um,
jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, and thinking about that again, there's no formula, and I wish there was, but there's not. And so what you have to recognize is that there's just so many different factors. The demographics of your church is an incredibly important one. I would say that most churches that need, and I say this without any sort of quantitative data, but in my opinion, just from what I can see, I think that most churches that need revitalization need it just because they're aging.
Hmm.
It's a church that has had for a long time. Maybe there's a church split and a lot of the young people left, right? And
Yeah.
you're left with an older church. Maybe it's just a church that's in a rural area that over time there's just not as many people moving in, and so you're not going to see as many young families come in, and you're going to have what's just left with an older, especially in an older church like mine, is 42 years old. You're going to be left with original members who are
Yeah.
still there, but don't have the energy, much less I mean, they may have the drive, but maybe they don't have the energy to go out and actually do some of these things. They can't physically get out the door to go down and, hand out tracts on the street and somewhere,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of different reasons, and you have to recognize the demographics first and foremost, as well as the demographics of your area. I live in a town of about 7,000 people here in Wamego. And that's important for me to remember, because that means that there's not as many opportunities where there's going to be a massive amount of people around where I can start getting the word out.
Yeah.
Um, it's also, there's just a smaller pool to choose from. I used to live in a suburb of Houston. We had, I mean, quite literally probably 270,000 people, I think, in the suburb that I was in. And that's, I mean,
Yeah.
people were driving in from all over the place because it's like a 30-minute drive just to get to our church. And so we had a much bigger selection to choose from.
Yeah.
That sounds terrible. Not selection to choose from,
No,
but
I
you
hear
know what I
you.
mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
More people were exposed to the work that our church was doing just
Yeah.
by nature of there being more people around. And so you have to recognize those things and then start to figure out, well, where are the actual inflection points in my community where we can start to do some of this work again? And what are the things that we can do? You know, if you have an aging church in a small town like I do, then it may be really easy for you to say, hey, we're going to actually set up a table at this event that's going down in the community. And you just have to sit there. And if people come by, you can hand them a track and have a conversation with them, and that's great.
Yeah.
If you have younger people in your church and there's a community event like that going on, you can say, hey, we want to go and do some open air preaching and actually like active evangelism out there. And so I've done that a couple of times now, and that's been really beneficial. But it just depends on who you have and then what's going on around you.
Hmm.
So, you know, if you have a small town situation where there are a lot of community events, you know, Wamego is kind of the quintessential Midwestern American town where there's always some kind of festival going on once every couple of months,
Right.
and then we have a college next to us, and so that's another opportunity where we can do that. Not everyone
Mm.
has those benefits, and so you know it may be that if you're in a much smaller, more rural setting, that you actually need to energize your people in some way to say we're going to do this and intentionally find a way to do it where it's feasible for them to go out and knock on doors, you know, to
Right.
go out and have conversations with people in the community at large and try to bring them the gospel.
Yeah.
If you're in a much larger town, then it looks even different. You know, in Houston, we did like the trunk or treat thing, you know, around Halloween, where
Right.
we had people come to our parking lot and we were able to have conversations with them there because they're just driving by and they can see it that it's happening. That's not the case in a lot of places.
Yeah.
You know, you can send out Facebook advertisements in that kind of place, and it's going to hit a million homes in a small area because there are a million homes in a small area,
Yeah.
and that's not the case in every place. So it really just depends on where you're at, I'd say. And but the key is just trying to stoke, like I said before, stoke up that flame that people within your congregation, not just you, pastor, but people in your congregation have a desire to actually do outreach and to go out and do those things. Because ultimately, I know that's not the only form of revitalization, but what you're doing in your community is kind of the ultimate indicator of the life of your church.
Yeah. No, that's great to hear, Greg. And I think just jumping on that to give cultural examples that make sense in Canada and people at my church would recognize is that with younger people, but trying to reach the community, we went out and offered to shovel snow off driveways. That
Yeah.
made sense in Canada. It was a great way, and people love when you do some work for them. And of course, while the young adults were shoveling the snow, our pastor got to chat with the person and share the gospel and invite them to church. That's only partly true. Pastor Paul, he was very much shoveling snow, hard worker. So he was doing both. But and then as we built some steam, we just last year had a winter fest where we invited people to our church and we had a petting zoo and hot chocolate and all that kind of stuff. So stuff like that, it works. But I think it really much, we were only able to do that because we have a nice suburban church with a property. And the reality is a lot of churches might be, especially in big cities, you might be renting a place and not have that opportunity. So it's
Yeah.
going to look different for everyone. If a small town, you have events and et cetera, et cetera. So I really appreciate where you started. There isn't a formula per se. I think that's a large part because of different contexts. But maybe something we could get to now is there's also different people with different ages. So maybe, Greg, we can jump in and hear your perspective on the other side. And let's say, and you are a pastor who's trying to engage people and revitalize and outreach is a big part of that. What do you think are speaking to members of churches or congregants? What are things that you think that they could do to make your job easier in mobilizing them for outreach? Or what are things you think that would be, if people just started doing this on your own, you would be so encouraged to see and it would make
Yeah.
you excited? So, what are some of those
Yes.
things? Yeah.
Yeah. Before I get to that, I will
Yeah.
say one other thing. There's no formula, but there is a solution. Like there
Mm,
is a solution, and the solution is getting your people on fire for the gospel again.
there you go.
I don't. There's multiple maybe ways of approaching that and getting to it like that, but that's ultimately the goal. And when your people are on fire for the gospel again, and I think that happens through your preaching, I think that happens through Bible study and just the even visitations. I mean, all the general things that you're doing as a pastor, when you have that as an emphasis and you continually say, how can we then take that out and put it into practice, then people will catch on eventually. But when they start to catch on, to get to your question, I think the kinds of things that I like to see are when people in the congregation come to me and say, "Hey, I have this idea for a ministry."
Mm,
And when they come, and this is a key, the key is not that they're coming and saying, "I think that our church should do this."
yeah.
The key is that they're coming and saying, "I would like to do this,
Yeah.
and I would like for our church to help."
Yes.
Or something to that effect. To encourage somebody, a saint, to say, I have a good idea for a ministry, and I think it would really benefit our community. And so I want to lead this up and for our church to sort of work under it. That is I mean, a pastor will be overjoyed. They'll be elated that
Yeah.
somebody has this idea, and I promise you, they will fight tooth and nail for you to be able to finish it.
Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, that happens too little. Most people, whenever they are in the church and they hear, oh, we need to do more outreach, we need to do these things, what they're hearing in their head is, well, the church needs to start all of these things and then maybe I'll serve in them.
Mm,
No, especially as congregationalists, what pastors are asking for when they say that is for you as a congregant to think about how can you use the gifts that God has given to you to bring the gospel out into the community, and how can the church then support that,
right.
right? And so like I want to be able to raise up people who are street preachers, and I want our eventually I would love for our church to have a ministry of several men who are able to go out down to our Kansas State University campus, right,
Yeah.
15 minutes down the road, and stand there and do street preaching and hand out tracts and do open air evangelism. And that's a great thing. But that's not the only thing that there is. And we have a lady in our church, God bless her, I love her, and she's a little old lady who does this wonderful ministry called the Jesus Rolls Along Book Ministry. And she
Mm,
goes and she has a bunch of books and she goes from door to door and she basically offers, hey, these are some books that I have. Are there anything that you're struggling with that, we have something to address that with? And that's her way of getting the gospel out and she gives a tract with it. And that's a good way of getting the gospel out into the community and with something, and that's kind of a different thing and a unique thing, but it's something that's easy for her to do because she just has a lot of books and knowledge and access to all the books that we have. And so there's little things like that. When people come up with those, a pastor is going to fight for you to be able to continue in those ministries and to grow them and to see how they sort of take root in the community. Um,
yeah.
and ultimately, I'll say that whenever you start to get into meetings and people are trying to report on their various ministries, and there's just a consistent stream of, well, nothing's really happening. That's when you start to get concerned, and you want to
Mm,
try to bring those people along and say, okay, well, if nothing's really happening in this ministry right now, how can it happen, or where do you need to shift to something else,
right.
to where you can bring new life to something that is going on. So yeah, there's a lot of different sort of moves that can happen, but the key is a congregant willing to take ownership for something and say, I want this ministry to happen, and I'm willing to work to make it happen.
Yeah.
Because pastors only have so much time in the day. You
Yeah.
want your pastors to be focused on the ministry of the word in your church. And yes, of course, like they're going to be out there doing other things. They're going to be out there shoveling snow and preaching the gospel with people, and they should be.
Yeah.
But the primary focus of their ministry is to preach the word to you. So what does it say in Ephesians 4? It's that their job is for the edification of the body in Christ and for the equipping of the saints for the work of the ministry.
Right.
So our job is to equip you to go out and do those things. And we're not trying, it's not a way of getting out of the ministry. Believe me, I love going out and doing open air preaching and evangelism and those kinds of things. But I have a task set before me by God as a pastor, and it is to equip you for the work of your ministry. But that means that you need to work to identify and discern what your gifts are as a congregant, so that you can then turn those outward and then ask your pastor for prayer, for support, and for advertising to the church to say, hey, I need some help with this, whatever it may be. But yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I would say on that.
No, Greg, that's very helpful. And a bridge point that I see is that often when people join churches, not only do they need to know what the church believes because they're professing that, but I think so often when you become a member at a church, you're agreeing to take part in the mission of the church. And as congregationalists, we not only is it not just up to the pastor elders, but it's up to the congregants defend and propagate the faith. So taking
Why
that
church
on,
covenants are so important, by the way.
yeah,
Like we don't talk enough about those. We talk about confessions all the time, but we
yeah,
never ever talk about our church covenants. And so
right.
we've actually taken a practice now. Well, we haven't quite started implementing yet, but we will actually this Sunday. We'll be reading our church covenant aloud together once again at our members meeting,
Yeah,
and it's just something to continually remind you because that's where the practice comes from. We
right.
have our piety within the confession. The practice is kind of contained in the covenant.
Greg, we're going to have to do another call because I think there's several things in the concept of church covenants that need to come out. Agreeing to live a certain way, how that relates to church discipline, and then also the church's witness. So both the positive and the negative. A lot
Yeah.
that could be said there. I got really excited, so I'm trying to contain it so that we can close this one out and come back on another one, I think. But
Yep.
I think that again, I just want to reiterate what Greg is saying. Something that my pastor during my internship impressed upon me is that lots of people have a lot of great ideas, but you have to be able to say, hey, so yeah, that sound outreach to this and that sounds great. When are you going to get started?
Yeah.
Not expecting the pastor to be able to do everything where pastors do so much. And without getting into the sabbatical jokes, those have been funny lately, but pastors already do a lot of work and there is a lot more work that needs to be done. And I think that's where members, hey, you are a member of a Baptist church. That is a great privilege, but it's also with that great privilege comes great responsibility. I avoided the Spider-Man direct quote, but that's where I think people take that on and work with other people and encourage other people to come alongside each other. That's part of what it means to be a member of a church. And I think one thing I also want to say is that when you start doing that, not only are you a benefit to the community, to the church itself, but I think people, that's where you will see how God works in your own life as well. I think there's something there, whether it's the ESL ministry or the seniors home visits or whatever it might be. You might be thinking it's nothing really, but we know that's exactly where God wants us to be and working. So Greg, we've gone on for a while. I know that you have stuff going on. You're a busy pastor, so maybe now is a great time. We have, I think, some ideas where I'll have to bring you back on or encourage you to get back to uploading yourself when you have time, responsibly, of course. But maybe I'll ask you, in light of this conversation or anything else, if you could give one final encouragement to my audience. It could be related or not, but just one thing that you would say just to leave people to think about or reflect upon.
Yeah. I'll say two things, one
Yeah.
to pastors and one to congregants.
Yeah.
Um, if you're a pastor, be humble, as I mentioned before, be humble and be slow. Nothing take you have to think in the terms of the long game. The more I think of like short-term gains, the more frustrated I get. But when I start to think of how over 2 years God has worked in our church, then I get much more encouraged.
Yeah.
And I think that as you continue to look in the long term, you'll continue to see things that you can slowly work toward, and you'll start to see those things come into place. Write those things down and be ready for it. But also, um, while being humble and being patient, you also must, in a weird paradoxical sort of way, you must have an urgency. Like there really does need to be something within your preaching, within the way that you speak with people, that you would actually encourage them to go forward and do those practices in terms of revitalization. You have to stoke the flame. Like
Mm,
you can say, be patient, be humble, and it may need to be a slow and steady stream, but there has to be that stream to get people on fire for the gospel again, that they might go out and do some of these things. You want to see your church grow. If you want to see your church have a bigger impact in the community, then what you need to do is do not pull back whenever you're saying that Jesus Christ has done these things for us. We believe these things about the scriptures, and this is how you go and apply it. Do not skimp on application in your sermons. Do
yeah.
not skimp on application in your ministry of the word and one-on-one conversations with your congregants. Like expect that people that the spirit is going to work in people in such a way through your ministry that they will eventually go out and have a desire to minister in some way and then find ways to foster those things. That's your goal. Your job is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, and congregants, your job is to be equipped. And so you do need to actually start thinking in terms of, okay, how do I serve this church in such a way that it is an advance for the gospel of Christ and the king and his kingdom here in this place in which I live? How do I use my gifts? That's
Mm,
a question that people don't reckon with enough.
Yeah.
I've been gifted in this way. Well, maybe there's a bunch of different unique things that no one's thought of, and how you can be reaching out to people in that way. I know people who, if you're a young person who's really savvy on social media and stuff like that, I guarantee you, if you're in, especially if you're in a smaller church, man, let's put it this way, I would kill to have somebody in my church. No, I wouldn't kill. That's I would be very glad to have somebody in
Yes,
my church
much better.
who
Yeah.
who is so savvy enough with social media and has just enough time and desire to
Mm,
go and make clips of sermons, or go onto Instagram and post advertisements, or go onto Facebook and like to take control of the social media accounts, because quite honestly, that's where so much of our
yes.
advertisements for our churches these days are. To come in and revamp our website. I did that when I first got here because that's a gift that God has given to me, but it's a hard thing for me to continually update and focus on because it's just so far down the totem pole. For somebody to come in and say, I can do that. I've done that for my job or for the like, be thinking about those places in which you're gifted and how you might either A, relieve duties that the pastor is doing that they shouldn't be doing to begin with, because it's not in their job description, but they do it because they try to get it, they're trying to help things along, or new opportunities for ministry. Both of those things are just so encouraging to a pastor, and I think so honoring to Christ, that congregants need to be consistently reckoning with, how do I use those gifts God's given to me? So,
Yeah. No, Greg, two wonderful encouragements, both to pastors and congregants. And I will just echo for the congregants, it could be things that are so small, but would have a tremendous effect from social media. I think that's a huge one that we don't want to neglect. But also one more thing, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot. If you're able to drive, I'm sure there are seniors who would
yeah.
appreciate a ride. It could be things just an extra 15 minutes on that Sunday morning, and that would be wonderful. And there are tons of things like that. Ask your pastor, and that's something I'm sure your pastor will want to help you with. So, Greg, two
We have
great words.
sorry, not
Yep,
to interrupt you. We have a lady in the church who
yep,
has started coming to water our flowers and water our plants, and she comes pretty much every day. And
no,
every time I see her out there, I think, wow, what a blessing that I don't have to worry about those flowers dying. Like, I don't, it's
yeah,
just completely removed from my mind that these
right.
plants, which we have some beautiful plants that have been held up through the years, that they're all fine and that I don't have to worry about them at all. And actually, they look better than ever. So,
Yeah. No,
props
and
to Penny.
there are so many small things that make a tremendous
Yeah.
difference. And I think people, once you start doing them, you'll see that tremendous difference. So, Greg, great word, great conversation. I encourage people at the end now, if you have any questions or any follow-up, they can leave them in the comments below. I'm sure Greg and I will keep an eye out. We'd love to chat more. And of course, encourage you to talk to your pastor. And if you're a pastor, talk to other pastors. You're not in this alone. So, Greg, great final word, great conversation. I encourage people to subscribe to Greg's channel, encourage him to upload as he can. I'm going to keep saying it, but of course, responsibly, I'll keep saying that as well too. But Greg, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a blessing, I'm sure, to so many people.
Absolutely. It's been a privilege.